You're all really welcome to our event tonight. Lovely to see you. My name is Sarah Williamson. I'm a Corrymeela member, and I'm delighted to be hosting our event tonight. This series is called Theology in Conversation, and it's hosted by Corrymeela, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. I have been a member of the Corrymeela community for 10 years. And part of what we're trying out and embodying in these sessions is a little bit like being in the dining room of the Corrymeela Centre in Ballycastle. And in the 10 years that I've been going there, I've met lots of different people I agree with and disagree with. And we sit round chatting, and somehow I come away changed. So what we're doing in Theology in Conversation is we're not having a lecture or a debate. I've been to some great lectures and debates during lockdown. In these 6 sessions, we're offering 2 or 3 people who are giving input, yes, with some questions, but it might meander a little because it's a conversation. And there's something kind of relational behind what we're doing. And we're inviting you to join in by listening and asking questions and considering where the edges are for you, what questions you're living with that you'll take out there and do some more thinking about, what you'll go away and research. And maybe then there'll be something that we can offer to help you continue on that journey of exploration. So conversations start things and move things on. They aren't everything, but there's something. And that's the format, I suppose, that we are experimenting with this Lent, because that's something as a Corrymeela community that we have found very powerful, is being changed through the power of conversation. So we'll be here for an hour. We'll have about 25 minutes of conversation between myself and our guests, and then we'll move into questions. So I would encourage you to do 2 things. One is to put your Zoom onto speaker view. And the second is to use the chat box to type your questions. So please, of course, say hello from wherever you are in the world, if you'd like, just to give us a flavour of who's here. But if at any point you can throw in your questions into the chat box, and then I'll get those fed through, and we'll ask some of those then whenever the time comes. Okay, so I'm going to introduce tonight's theme and introduce our speakers. So tonight's theme is reproductive justice, which we will learn can be defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. As we hear from Edem and Kellie, we'll be talking about how all of these issues are interlinked, and where we'll talk about reproductive justice from a number of different angles. So as we move through our conversation, we'll learn a little bit about what reproductive justice is. We'll talk about it from a theological perspective, touching on some of how the Bible has been used, I suppose, to support different arguments about abortion. We will maybe discuss some of the history of the discourse about reproductive justice and abortion rights in Northern Ireland, UK, and elsewhere. And we'll hear a little bit, I hope we get time to hear a lot, about the activism that Kellie and Edem are both involved in and why they think it's important. So our guests are Edem first, who is co-director of Decolonizing Contraception. She is a political organizer whose work ranges from feminism, anti-racism, anti-cuts, and sexual health. She has 7 years working experience in the sector of sexual and reproductive health and is founder of Christians for Choice. Kellie is a feminist activist working on grassroots campaigns with Belfast Feminist Network, Alliance for Choice, and Reclaim the Agenda. She has worked in community development, human rights education, and most recently as the women's sector lobbyist with Women's Resource and Development Agency. Kellie is currently a PhD researcher at the University of Ulster, studying progressive faith discourse on abortion and reproductive justice. So we are delighted to have you both with us this evening. So maybe I'll start with you, Edem. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and explain a little bit about what reproductive justice is and why it's so important to you?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for having me during this discussion today. So as Sarah said earlier, I'm co-director of an organization called Decolonizing Contraception. And basically we work for Black and communities of color, really to address some of the historical violence, this historical but especially particularly in the medical field. So we talk about eugenics, we talk about racism, we talk about, you know, experiments being done on Black and brown people across societies, not just in America, but Latin America, Asia, and on the continent as well. So part of what the work that we do is trying to address how those systematic injustices, because that's what we would call them, affect the way in which those communities engage with the sector now and are able to access care. So when you look across the board, particularly for communities that aren't white, or particularly communities that are not racialized as white, experience a lot of health inequalities. And this is due to lack of education, you know, fears around access to medical care, and a lot of what we have in the community that is passed down that people have experienced. Because sometimes what people forget is, although the experiments are not happening on us today, we come from a community the experiments did happen on people, and that sort of that collective memory, that memory of that horrific things that happen, reverberates to the community, right? It gets handed down and it gets passed on. So when we talk about reproductive justice, like Sarah said earlier, we're talking about the rights of people to choose to have children, not have children, to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children and parent those children in safe and sustainable communities. And once you understand reproductive justice framework, I guess we get to move away from the discourse, particularly around choice in relation to abortion, and we start discussing access, right? Because if the law guarantees people the right to have abortion, we know that access continues to be an issue. And in many ways, that's what the reproductive justice framework likes to address. It was a framework that was developed by women of color, particularly in the United States. It was developed by Sister Song, which is a reproductive rights, reproductive justice movement in America. And it was developed around the 90s. And it's something that those of us, you know, it's an ethos that decolonizing contraception has really at the core of what we do. And a lot of the issues we see today, it really stems from what reproductive justice framework is trying to address. So perhaps I would say the most recent thing that we're seeing that I think that we can include in reproductive justice is about the murder of the young woman in Clapham in London right now. That's a reproductive justice issue, because it's the right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, is the right to live in sustainable and safe communities. This person was making their way home and they were not able to make their way home. And, you know, it's provoked a much wider discussion about violence that are perpetrated against women, not just from the police, but by men more generally. And I think that's also really in the reproductive justice framework. So like I said earlier, I think we need to move away from abortion necessarily being a conversation around choice, around a conversation that is right or wrong, but a conversation that is giving people access and is giving people the bodily autonomy, right? So if you don't believe that abortion is something for you, I'm not going to force you to go down that route. But if you do believe it's something for you, you have the right to access that service, free of, you know, someone trying to change your mind, free of being, you know, harassed outside a clinic, inside a clinic. You know, a lot of protests outside abortion clinics, particularly during Lent. Which for me, it's always baffling, because ultimately, if you have a conversation with someone and they choose that, you know, that they decide that abortion is still the way from them. I think, like, for me, my Christian faith allows me to respect that person's choice. It doesn't allow me to force my choice on somebody who doesn't want it. And particularly when we see like the harassment around clinic, it's not very Christian. And for me, I think that like the Christian faith, I think people's faith is strongest when they choose to believe. We can't force people to believe in something that they don't. So I think sometimes what we do is we people end up living in fear. People end up accessing services that people end up not accessing services that they want to, but not ultimately because they believe, but because they're being fearmongered into doing so. So I'm gonna stop there so that Kellie can come in a bit more. And I hope I've not said everything, Kellie.
No, I mean, so first of all, wonderful to have you with us. And I suppose what you've given us a whistle stop tour into something that certainly for me is fairly new, and I guess we're going to learn about a lot more tonight about the couching, if you like, of reproductive rights, or the issue and the question of abortion within a much bigger frame, which is around the right to safety, to parent, to not parent, economic justice, so linking to some of what we talked about in our session last week, and all of that. I think, and I suppose I just to clarify for people who are listening who may not know, there's a huge, I suppose, reverberation this week following the murder of a woman, Sarah Everard, in London, and just some of the stuff that happened last night whenever a range of women went to carry out a vigil in her memory in London, and some of us on the call tonight were at an online vigil here in Belfast. So it's helpful to have that reference, because I think it's to talk about the issue of women's bodies and women's safety. I think for a lot of us that's front and center, and I know, Kellie, maybe that's something that you'll want to start with, as you tell us a little bit about yourself, and I suppose why this issue of reproductive justice and all of that that which is contained in that is important to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, I think it has to be said for me up front that I come into this conversation tonight glad that we're having it, but also very emotional, as I'm sure a lot of people in the call are. This has been a week where, I mean, I can't remember a time when I felt as conscious of my gender as I have this week, because we came into this week with International Women's Day, and here in Belfast we had some incredible events and solidarity. And last Saturday I was on a virtual IWD rally with all of my friends and long-term comrades and sisters, and we were crying with joy that we were coming together. And then last night we were on another call together, but our tears were very different this time. And then to have Mother's Day today, and all that brings for me in terms of my own lived experience of motherhood, and the ups and downs of all my reproductive experiences. So yeah, I just want to bring all of that really into this arena as we talk about these issues, because that's real, that's lived experience, and that's where we come from. These are not abstract ideas or concepts. So yeah, I'm a Belfast resident, and as you said, Sarah, I've been involved in feminist activism here for some years. Going back before that, I have been involved in Christian communities here for many, many years, mostly my whole life. Probably around 10 to 12 years ago, had a bit of a crossroads where I felt like I had to kind of choose between my faith and my social activism, my feminism, because I wasn't exposed to any theology that allowed me to embrace both of those. And I certainly wasn't involved in any faith communities that allowed me to carry my feminist values into them. So I've been away from the church for a long, long time. I'm very much shaped by social justice issues that I've been involved in here. When it comes to these reproductive justice issues, for me, I think I have come from what Edem described as that kind of traditional choice-based movement. But on the other side of that, in my wider feminist activism, everything I was doing was structural. As I supported women in the grassroots women's community sector, it's all about economic justice. It's all about the structural ways that their lives are shaped by patriarchy and misogyny and oppressive state policies around welfare cuts, and all of that structural stuff has always been there. But for some reason, I had never really put the two things together enough until I became aware of the reproductive justice framework, and it just made sense. It was just like, these women are showing us the way. Like, this is the future of the abortion rights movement. And so you can see reproductive justice being adopted across the world at a grassroots level. It's a theory, but it's praxis, and everybody's trying to do abortion rights activism differently because of reproductive justice. So yeah, and what we've done here in Northern Ireland, I've been very involved in the campaigning around decriminalisation of abortion here, which is something that's quite hard to say in some faith circles. But it has been extremely important for me, and it comes from that belief in reproductive justice, because it's about the impact of the criminalisation of abortion on all kinds of different women and people. And we've always talked about that here in our campaigning in Northern Ireland, because if you think about who had access to abortion in Northern Ireland before October of last year, when it was decriminalised, they were well-off women. There were women with financial resources. If you had the resources, you've never really been denied an abortion in Northern Ireland, because an EasyJet flight to Liverpool would have you there and back in the same day. Now, the stigma and the shame and everything else that you carry when you make that journey is a whole other issue. But in practical terms, abortion decriminalisation is a social justice issue, because what was happening here for the last 5 years leading up to that was the women that were having to take illegal pills that they bought off the internet were women who didn't have the financial resources to travel, and they were the ones being criminalised. So it was essentially the criminalisation of poverty. And that's something that, if you believe in social justice and the theology of social justice within your Christian faith, that you just, we can't tolerate that. That's not something that we should sit back and be happy with that. So yeah, there's lots more I could probably say as well. As Edem said, you don't know where to stop really, but that'll do, I guess, for an introduction.
But I suppose for people who are new to using this phrase or this concept of reproductive justice, partly it is talking about the right to parent or to not parent, which includes abortion rights, but it's putting it within this bigger frame and conversation, because that's where it needs to sit. Is that the best way to, I suppose, to simplify it? Kellie, just to come back to you.
Yeah, for me, I guess you could look at it in terms of the journey of understanding that I've gone on, because you could be involved in fighting for better abortion law and policy, the decriminalisation of abortion, purely on a basis of like my body, my choice, an individualistic, I want to feel that I can make all the choices that I should have the right to make. Or you can look at that law, that criminal law, from a structural perspective. And you can think about how that law impacts on all different people. And that's what reproductive justice, I guess, has brought to activism here in Northern Ireland around these issues. Because while I'm campaigning for that, I'm also campaigning for an end to the 2-child cap on universal credit, because that is punishing poor women, and it's reproductive coercion, because we know that actually removing child benefits after you've had your second child is forcing women into feeling that they have to have abortions because they physically can't support their families. So that's a reproductive justice issue. I'm also campaigning on childcare. We need universal childcare in Northern Ireland. We have the worst childcare provision of anywhere in the UK. We get no state-funded hours practically. So that's a reproductive justice issue, because if you can't get childcare, and it's particularly an issue for parents of disabled children. So there's a conversation going on right now around in the Northern Ireland Assembly around abortion and its connection with fetal anomaly and different diagnoses, fetal diagnoses. I absolutely believe that we need to completely transform society in Northern Ireland with regards to support for disabled children. The parents that I've spoken to who just haven't had a holiday since their child was born because they cannot get any childcare that meets their child's needs. So the hypocrisy for me of politicians, for example, who push for legislation around reproductive choice based on this issue, and yet do absolutely nothing, and not only do nothing, actually introduce detrimental policies when it comes to supporting disabled people and disabled children in particular. So yeah, that's maybe that paints a bit more of a picture of what I'm talking about
really
there.
helpful. So I suppose then, because we're here to talk about theology, Edem, I'd love to hear about Christians for Choice and your work around that. So where did that come from, and how did you set that up, and what's that been about?
Yeah, so I've been like, I'd say like my official pro-choice journey started about a decade ago. I think prior to that, what I had been taught like religiously and like culturally, because I'm Ghanaian and from a community that sometimes it's quite hard to see where like religion and culture sort of like they blend in quite seamlessly. So up until that point, I was very much, I did not know what it entailed. I was very much like, oh, you shouldn't do this thing. And then obviously I had the experience of a friend of mine who was also Christian, who got pregnant, had a son, was pregnant again, and just was like, I absolutely cannot do this again. And I was like, well, what do you mean? She's like, I can't do this again. Like, I need to, you know, and having to support her through the process completely like transformed me. And it's like, no, like, why should people be forced to carry out pregnancies because of our, you know, sort of moral judgment on them, right? And to quote my very good friend Annie, who says, you know, it's not helpful to make moral critiques of people when you don't know the actual reality of the situation in which they're in. And I find like a lot of these sort of laws and a lot of the way that we understand life at the moment, a lot of way we see things really come from like a moral critique, right? Like we're morally critiquing people for the choices that they make. So getting involved in abortion rights is really like transformative for me. Having that experience with my friend was really transformative for me. And then, you know, in my activism in abortion rights, we had to, you know, launch campaigns and do lots of things around lots of different things. And a lot of time, you know, our biggest opposition to what we're doing tend to be some religious group, mainly Christian, mainly evangelical groups. So, you know, I think it was like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where we were discussing sort of the issues around protests around clinics during Lent, right? Which get really, really intense. We had a colleague on the committee who was in Wales who said that, you know, a lot of people in the community where, you know, I think it was in Cardiff, were really, really upset by the graphic images, because this clinic was quite central, the graphic images that people had, the attempt to sort of visualize and say that, you know, and again, offer a moral critique of the women and people going into the clinic and choosing to end their pregnancies, right? And how that was really impacting people. And we just had lots of different conversations. It was like, you know, a lot of people in the Christian faith, and almost the Christian faith in itself has sort of been the flag bearer of like anti-choice, anti-abortion activity. And I said, you know, but I know lots of people who belong to the faith who don't believe in that, who believe in, you know, individuals' rights to do whatever they want with their pregnancy. So we had lots of different conversations, and we decided to launch this statement, which was really about condemning the harassment, right? The harassment of individuals, the graphic images outside clinic, the sort of the moral judgment and critique of people going into these buildings, particularly around Lent, to say, you know what, you are entitled to your position, you are entitled to your faith, but what you're not entitled to is to force that down on other people and make their life harder because of it. And it really, really boils down to me, you know, when we were sort of discussing and we were writing, you know, I'd written an article in the Huffington Post, you know, we'd do statements on abortion rights every year, getting people to sign it. And I just really got to the point where I was like, you know what, if you don't believe that your faith is that strong, that you have to sort of, you know, show graphic images and essentially maybe force and bully people into believing in something that you believe, I think that that's kind of where you lost, because I understand people's faith being the strongest when they choose, right? Here's the word again, choice. So I reuse it in the abortion context, but I was like, actually, let's flip it on its head. Isn't our faith the strongest if people individually of their own accord choose to believe, and we're not sort of moralizing and scaring and, you know, fear mongering them into believing? And that's sort of how Christians for Choice came about. I mean, our work is mainly focused around sort of countering anti-abortion activities outside clinics, particularly during Lent, because you have people outside for the 40 days with candles. It's like, you know, there's a sort of mourning going on, which makes me feel really uncomfortable sometimes. I'm like, why are you mourning something that somebody else isn't mourning? It's taking an active choice in doing, because that's how, you know, they want to carry on with their life. So that's sort of where Christians for Choice developed and came from. It was a chance for me as a Christian to vocally say that I was in support of the rights of women and people to have an abortion, and for other people to also come out, because I received a lot of messages and stuff, particularly, you know, I know this is a different audience I'm talking to, but particularly from sort of like the Black African experience. It is not something that, you know, people are vocal and open about. Yet when we look at the stats, so I was doing some work recently with DC. We had some money to do some work around the experiences of people of African, Caribbean, and Asian descent around abortion. And when you look at the stats, we are there. But when you look at the conversation, when you look at the activism, we're missing. And there's sort of a bit of a disconnect, because I know that because of our moralizing in the Christian faith, a lot of people carry guilt and shame around having to choose to end a pregnancy. In fact, when I was doing the research, one of the things that, came out was this particular person who, found, their parent organized their abortion. They didn't really have a conversation about it. They were just sort of, well, you're not having the child, organized everything for them. And then they found out later down the line that parent had an abortion. In fact, that parent had 2 abortions. And that person was like, well, why didn't you have a conversation with me about that? Because that would have been a moment for us to come together, because we had a shared experience. But that parent was feeling so much guilt and shame that when there was an opportunity for them to bond with their child in a very meaningful way, that wasn't able to happen. So I'm going to stop there.
Wow. Thank you. And amazing, I think, to hear experience beyond white experience, because that, I suppose, is really central to reproductive justice, and where we need to get to in so many things, where we've got the wrong lens. So I guess linked to that, so Kellie, Edem has used words like choice and moral, and I suppose for people who are listening, the rhetoric around choice is quite often pitted against the unborn child and its voice or not, and scriptural verses like from the Psalms, like you knit me together in your mother's womb. There's a couple of particular verses in the Old Testament, actually, of the Christian scriptures, because there isn't a lot in the New Testament. I suppose it's Christ who is more the image of God, as opposed to this notion of the fetus or the unborn child. So what have you done? Obviously, you're doing your PhD and all this, and I'm sure your literature reviews and all of that are kind of awful things that you spend your days doing. So what have you learned, I suppose, around what the biblical texts like that, and what they mean, and how do you read those? If reproductive justice and all that complexity that you talked about earlier and that Edem has been talking about, how do you then read scripture?
Well, when I look at this issue through that lens, it's, to be honest, no different than any other issue, in that the main thing you find is that the biblical texts disagree with themselves. There is no agreement within what we call the Bible when it comes to this issue. There are contradictory passages that we could take meaning from. And what's clearly happened over many years, I suppose, is that one kind of unifying discourse around abortion has established itself based on particular interpretations of those passages that you mentioned. And that's become used to completely quell any discussion, any conversation, any disagreement theologically, and just been called the biblical view. This is the biblical view on abortion. And I'm told that all the time, that I'm a bad Christian because I'm going against the biblical view. But the things that people say aren't really what I see in terms of the interpretation. So the passage you mentioned there about from the Psalms, I think there's lots of things that we've had to revisit in the Psalms because we recognize what the Psalms were and the meaning that they have and the metaphor that is contained within them. And also that particular passage speaks to someone, to an individual, and isn't necessarily supposed to be applied to all of humanity. There's so many contradictory texts around the idea of when life begins. And the Bible, certainly, if it leans towards anything, it leans towards a view that life begins with breath. And that has been explored by a number of authors and biblical scholars. One of the things I'm really interested in as well, as we're talking about reproductive justice, which calls us to take a structural approach to things, is we need to take a structural approach to our theology. So for me, it's not just about trying to knit together the best biblical text to tell a particular story around when life begins or things like that, but also to think about how our theology has emerged over many, many years. So it's the evolution of concepts that are very central to this issue. So there's a very strong concept that every fetus is imprinted with God's image. So the kind of concept of Imago Dei, which has been used a lot by kind of anti-choice campaigners to say, abortion should be prohibited for this reason. But if we look through church history and the early church fathers and how this was debated, concepts like that we might think are established facts of the faith, they were developed through a very iterative process, and through a process of huge amounts of disagreement and dissent. And ultimately, the views that won out were the views of the people that held most power. So power, deconstructing ideas of power, and all of the structural, journey of the development of our faith has to be taken into account. There's a fantastic book, if anybody's really interested in going into detail on this, there's a fantastic book by a religious scholar called Margaret Kamitsuka, called Abortion and the Christian Tradition, a pro-choice theological ethic. And you will not get a more detailed look at the theology of this and the development of this issue across church history. I'm a social scientist, not a theologian, and reading this book hurt my brain a little bit, I have to say. But if you've studied theology and you're interested in the evolution of these core concepts and values of our faith, then I would absolutely recommend reading her book. And for me, I have to reconcile the theology of the issue with the lived experience. Again, like Edem talked about people's stories that influenced her. That's the same for me. And so in my studies, what I've started with was people of faith have abortions. People of faith have abortions at the same rate as their non-religious peers. That's the reality. So we have to start with that. And I'm trying to study where that disconnect comes from between the official doctrine of most Christian denominations and the lived experience of women who need abortions, whether they're religious or not, whether they believe abortion is right or wrong. Plenty of people who believe abortion is wrong have abortions. So our theology has to be a lived theology that actually helps make sense of the world, the choices people make, the reasons people have to make the choices that they make, all of that. So I've been studying, I've actually just completed, well, it'll never be totally completed, but I'm doing an analysis of pro-choice faith discourse, because there is so much out there. I don't think people understand the history of their own denominations half the time as well. Like the very strong anti-choice rhetoric that we have now came from a very specific period of time in American evangelical history to a large extent. I know the Catholic Church has had a longer history with this issue, but I come from Protestant evangelical kind of background. So that's what I've started looking into. In the late 70s, the rise of the moral majority movement that was operationalized basically by the Republican Party, who were trying to get Reagan into power, that changed everything. Up until that point, most mainline Protestant denominations were very supportive. There was a minister or a pastor, clergy on every Planned Parenthood committee in the United States. Can you imagine? And that actually still is the case. They just there's a smaller pool to draw from now, because a lot of those Protestant denominations fell away as the kind of culture war around abortion intensified. But the history of it is the first ever legal abortion clinic in the United States was opened by a minister, a clergyman called Howard Moody, who had spent 5 years previous to that running a massive illegal underground abortion support network, making sure that women who were dying in huge numbers from unsafe abortions, him and his fellow clergy, there were around I think around 1,400 clergy in this network at its peak all over the country, who were signposting women to safe abortion providers. I mean, clergy have been at the forefront of this movement, and we have to understand that history. We have to understand how thin some of our rhetoric is around it. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Really interesting, and I suppose even just to hear Glennon Doyle, who's a bit of a pop like writer who I really like. In a recent book that she wrote, she has a whole section on that, around that change in the church's mind in the 60s, because I don't think that within the evangelical movement there's broad understanding of that change. And also the fact that within Judaism there's a real mix of views with regard to the fetus and the status of the fetus. So it certainly isn't with regard to both Hebrew scriptures and New Testament, there isn't clarity or one clear theology on that. I'm going to kick to a question, Edem, if you're happy. Let me just bring it up here. So a few people have sort of wanted to ask about the rights of the fetus and the unborn child. So I suppose just to ask you, many people seriously disagree with abortion. Is there such a thing as a constructive conversation about the rights of the woman and the rights of the fetus? How do we begin to have those conversations well, or how do we continue to have them well?
I'm always for having a conversation. I mean, if people Google me, they would find that I've been on Premier Christian Radio and had a conversation around abortion before, as someone from a pro-choice perspective. I think for me, it's like, you know, who is here and who like sort of view sort of life, who sort of rights gets to be like the core center of the conversation. That is the woman or the person that is here, right? Like they're ultimately existing is where we start that conversation from, and whatever options that they choose to take is where we start the conversation from. And sometimes what I really struggle with when people want to again moralize about the rights of the fetus, the rights of the unborn, is that those people that do that, and I hate to do an either or argument, but I think that sometimes I would take that position a little bit more seriously if they put that much energy and effort into women who have children that they can't look after. Like, what are we doing for the women who have, as people say, carried on the pregnancy and had the child, right? And I'm from a community and I'm from a culture where having children is a blessing, right? Like, as a woman, it's an integral part to your life. But where are all the people that are going to come around and help you look after this child that they've moralized to you to bring into this world? And we do not have enough of that conversation. I'm sorry, I would take that position seriously if people put half the amount of energy and effort into actually supporting women. As Kellie was saying earlier around childcare, I have a friend who's around my age who has a little one who pays thousands of pounds in fees every month to take her child to nursery so that she can work. Where is the support for her? Where is the help for her? She's chosen to have a child, but nobody's out there to support and help her. And we don't have nearly enough of that conversation for me to take the position about what about the human rights of the unborn? Well, that person isn't here yet, so we can't begin to debate their human rights. What we have to do is protect, extend, and support the right of the person that is here to choose whether to have the pregnancy or not to. And that's my position on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, jump in on that and then I'll give you another question, Kellie.
Well, I'm really conscious that I have been around the pro-choice circles for a long time, and see people that campaign for abortion rights, they are the most compassionate people that I have ever met, and the amount of compassion for that holistic view is really evident to me. Like, for example, I will never forget having a conversation with a woman who's been very high profile in abortion rights policy advocacy over many years in the UK. And she talked to me about how she was looking at statistics one year around abortion and the dates that, you know, late term abortions. And late term abortions are often the ones that cause people the most distress. When you think about that, it's really difficult to imagine if you've been pregnant yourself in particular. This woman saw in the statistics a pregnancy that had been terminated very late, like well into the third trimester, and it troubled her because she's a compassionate human being, and she also wanted to understand it, because if she's doing this advocacy, she wanted to feel that she understood what was going on there. Why was that termination carried out so late in that pregnancy? And because of her network, she managed to track down the obstetrician who'd been involved, and the story blew her away. Basically, it was a woman who'd been given a diagnosis that would be fatal. This was a fetus that would not be able to breathe outside of the womb. And so for this woman who was carrying her baby, because obviously I think in the language we use, it all comes down to what that pregnancy means for you. And for this woman, this was absolutely her baby. She knew the only place that baby could live was inside her womb. And she worked out a care plan with her obstetrician to keep her baby for as long as she possibly could. She did not want to birth the baby and have the baby suffocate and die. I'm sorry, this language is probably triggering for people who've been through situations like this. She made a decision. She wanted to terminate the pregnancy and not have that experience as part of it, but she wanted to have her baby alive inside her for as long as she could. And so they agreed to carry out the termination at that very late stage. Now, if somebody like Paul Given in the Northern Ireland Assembly just saw on a piece of paper that a termination was carried out at 30 something weeks, they would use that as a stick to beat you with, that like, you know, this is horrendous. Imagine aborting a baby at that late stage without knowing the story behind it. So for me, I just think that we have to remember what, you know, these are people's lives that we're talking about. And I think the conversation has to be around ethics. We've talked about it as a moral issue for too long. Yes, there is an ethics around the termination of pregnancy. Every medical practitioner who's involved in this knows that. Sometimes they get it wrong, sometimes they get it right. And we have to be talking about the ethics of this, not the morality of it.
It's interesting on that note, because
Can I jump in again, Sarah?
Oh yeah, go on ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, sometimes I completely agree with what Kellie was saying. Like, a lot of the people I've done pro-choice activism in are involved in lots of other things. As you said, Sarah, in my bio, I've been doing lots of different things from when I was in university. I'm involved in lots of different campaigns. I spent most of last year during the pandemic fundraising to help people in Ghana. You know, like, I really care about humanity, and I also care about a woman's right to choose to or to not continue a pregnancy. And for me, sometimes it's really difficult because people place this as us not caring about women, about us not, you know, but actually I think the other side doesn't care about women, because you essentially, you know, particularly when people talk about, you know, perhaps like women dying and stuff, you know, someone was saying earlier in the chat that, you know, not having legal abortion does not stop abortions from happening. So essentially what people say is they would rather women die than be able to access safe abortion. And I think that people really need to reflect on that.
Thank you. I want just to ask Kellie something, because it links to the discourse that's happening here at the minute around fetal abnormality and decisions around that. Someone has asked, I think, I've just lost it, hold on. So we've got a midwife who's asked this question. How do we address the screening of fetuses that seek to identify conditions such as Down syndrome, and what does this say about society's attitude to disability? So, and that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily from saying that choice is wrong, but it's I suppose it's touching on a little bit what you talked about earlier, Kellie, because I'm interested. I think yeah, what I'm enjoying learning around is around reproductive justice, this entire framework which wants to care at every stage. But what does that mean then for a society which is diverse? We know in England that there are much fewer people living with Down syndrome, for example, now than there were years before, because of decision around because of the access for abortion for Down syndrome, which is a really difficult and emotive issue for many. So I suppose just interested to hear about what this means for society's attitude to disability and all sorts of abilities.
I can comment a little bit on that, but I'm always loath to talk about things that I haven't got lived experience of, or to, you know, take a platform from a parent who's been through that. But I do have good friends who've been through it and try and listen to them as much as I can. And I think there is a real problem still within the diagnosis process. It's possibly the medicalization of that process. I've spoken to too many parents who've had very problematic conversations with their doctors, you know, to not pay attention to that. And I think that reproductive justice speaks to that, because disability rights is part of that framework. We have to get away from a situation where a doctor who has a lot of power is sitting telling you very medicalized facts about the diagnosis you're receiving without talking about the social factors, without you know, putting that in its wider context. And there can be coercion, and there can be coercion in particular then of Black and minority ethnic communities as well within that medical process. So again, I take a structural view to it. You know, there's things that need to be addressed. We don't have a lot of screening in Northern Ireland. We don't have any of the prenatal screening that you get in England before the 24-week scan. It's another part of why people in Northern Ireland have been often put in really terrible situations or sorry, the 20-week scan, where they get diagnoses at 20, 21 weeks, and then they have 3 weeks to figure out, you know, what they're going to do. And there's a problem as well around, and there's political voices right now who want to change the law to make sure that it's only fatal diagnoses that are legally accessible, and that is something that cannot happen. I have met friends who've been in situations where you don't get a fatal diagnosis. That's extremely rare. You get a probability of how likely it is that your child will survive. You get a discussion with your doctor about possible mitigating factors, possible factors that might change that, you know, make things worse, that prognosis worse. And then parents are sent away to sit and figure that out for themselves. And the way it was happening here for so many years was the doctor wouldn't even talk to you about what your next steps might be for fear of being criminalized. So you were left to go and phone someone in England and try and work it out and be told you had 3 weeks to do it before the time limit. And that's horrific. I have friends whose lives have been shattered by that process. So we cannot go back to that. I will fight tooth and nail alongside those people to make sure that we don't go back to that. Not because I have some horrific view about people with disabilities, which is the way it's always pitched, but because, you know, that's only a very small part of that story. The story for me is about families whose the life of their child is hanging in the balance, and they're being forced to make snap decisions with no support.
Thank you.
And can I jump in, Sarah?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, sometimes it's a bit of a moralizing going on, right? It's easier to blame individuals than it is to look at our society and say, you know, if I was put in that situation, how would other people treat my child? Like, we know how disabled people are treated in society. We know the lack of access to poor support, even though we've got, you know, a Disability Act and like loads of things have been done. Like, disabled people have had to put themselves in the streets to even get some of that respect, some of that dignity, some of those choices to be able to do the things they're able to do now. And when we think about the fact that we've just experienced austerity for 10 years, and the fact that, you know, we have, you know, official, you know, what's it called? I'm losing my words here, so I'm thinking in another language. We've had reports about the fact that austerity has killed a lot of disabled people. We are not having enough conversations about that. So if somebody is making a decision based on the disability of their child, let's stop the moralizing and have some compassion and say, look at the way we treat disabled people that are here now and how that's going to impact the decision that somebody's going to make about whether or not they're going to bring their disabled child into the world. And I think that we need to have more of those conversations and say, you know what, if we fought for a society where disabled people had the same level of access as everybody else, I think more people would be more than happy to bring their children as well, because they know that they wouldn't have to experience the horrific things that people are experiencing now. And like Kellie was saying, we don't have enough of that conversation. It always starts with, you know, and again, I'm from a culture that children are a blessing, but I see the way disabled children get treated from the moment they are born. It's a different vibe, right? Like, we see it, we know it. Why would somebody, you know, why don't we have compassion for somebody who sees that and says, you know what, I'd rather not put that child through that? Why don't we not have a bit more compassion, a bit more room, a bit more space for that experience, is what I would say.
Can I ask Edem about your work in terms of decolonizing contraception? And I think, so whether we're pro-choice or pro-life and choose to sit in one of those two binaries, probably most of us would hope we could, you know, wouldn't it be great if we lived in a world where we didn't have to have some of these discussions, I suppose. And what I think is really interesting is that in the States, whenever the Republicans are in power and they kind of clamp down and you know, tighten up on abortion, versus the Democrats who things tend to become a bit freer, I suppose, or there's better access to abortion. Actually, when the Democrats are in power, there's fewer abortions because they up access to contraception. You know, so, and again, right, you know, I'm sort of going, why wouldn't you try and get upstream on this thing? And this is in a context in Northern Ireland where I think people are probably taught about contraception, you know, on their final day of A levels. You know, I'm not, yeah, I don't know, but it felt like that whenever I was at school. So I'm sure I'm joking a little bit, but tell us about your work, because I think that's something that we probably need globally.
Yes. So it's so funny you just asked that, because I was thinking longer, right? I was thinking about the fact that my grandmother had like 10 kids, right? Like I have friends whose grandparents had 10 kids. So, you know, I have 10 aunties and 9 aunties and uncle, right? And I think about the fact that my grandmother had 10 kids massively reduced her capacity to do things in life that she wanted to do. And I think about the fact that my mom only had 2 kids. I think mostly due to contraception, although when she was pregnant with me, it failed that time, so I don't know what to say. But I'm here now, so that's fine. And then I think about, you know, the access to contraception, and I think about the fact that, you know, 30, 40, 60 years ago, women were dying in childbirth or having an excessive amount of children, which impacted the life of those children were able to have and impacted their own lives. And we think about contraception becoming available, like it being invented, it becoming a thing, and millions of women finally getting access to it and being able to determine the number of kids that they have, but then also being able to live the life that they wanted to live, right? Because that's a major important thing. Like women and people with uteruses are not on this world to be like a baby making machine. Like we're human beings with lives and desires and wants and things that we want to do, right? And we should have the opportunity to do that. So yes, so there is a direct link, right, between people having access to abortion, but people having access to contraception, but also really comprehensive sex education, right? Because like contraception is always, even when you have discussions with people with contraception, a lot of people have misconception around the hormones. Sometimes the hormones don't work for people's body. A lot of people have issues around it, right? But you're even able to navigate that if you have comprehensive sexual and reproductive health education, because then you know how your body works. You know, you can use the natural method to plan how you want to have children or not have children. And I think that that's incredibly important. In absence of that, people find themselves in really difficult situations where they need abortions and might have one. And I'm not going to say that I want contraception to stop abortions, although I know some people even believe that contraception are abortions. That's not how they work. But, you know, I think it's incredibly important that women and people with uteruses who can get pregnant are able to have adequate access to contraception, because if they don't, people then later on have pregnancies that they don't want to, or have children they might not even want themselves. Like, you know, we assume stopping people from having contraception means that they're going to have children and be happy. Sometimes people have children and not necessarily happy with that decision. So I think we must always go back to a society when people have all the tools, right? Have access to all the tools that they need to plan out the life that they want. And like you said, that definitely falls into the frame of reproductive justice, because it's about the choice to parent, not parent, but live in also sustainable communities and and have sustainable lives. So when we particularly even look at, you know, Black women, or if we want to look more broadly, particularly women of color, and I'm talking about that in sort of the European and American context, because outside of our places of origin, that's where we would congregate. You know, we see that, you know, perhaps like abortion or contraception have been used, right, in attempts to stop the growth of certain populations, the most recent being Latino and Black women, so Black immigrants in American ICE and detention centers being forced given hysterectomies, right? I don't see, you know, anti-choices having a conversation. We're not talking about that. The fact that people's reproductive rights are actually being taken away from them, right? Because they're seen as a threat, right? So that is being forced and taken away from them. And we know that, you know, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, again, abortions were freely and contraception were really freely, readily available in certain Black and Latino communities as an attempt to reduce the population. So when we talk again, and I think that's why it's really important for us to move from the moralizing aspects of things and really look at people's lives. So when we look at that historic, you know, sort of action that's happened, and we look at today, I can see why certain people in the Black communities and Latino communities are actually anti-abortion, because we're coming from a history where we actually didn't have the choice to make that decision. So now any attempt to open up a conversation to say this is an option that you have is immediately seen as an attempt to curtail and sort of like reduce the population of some. So the conversation is really complex. And again, like I really plead for people to move from sort of the moralizing aspects of things and really look at people's lives. I mean, you know, some people might be choosing to have abortions because maybe they're pregnant with a son who is a Black son. And we know the way that Black men are being killed and treated and brutalized, right? people are making decisions based on that, and they're allowed to make decisions based on that because the reproductive justice framework says the right to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. If you know the community you're going to bring your child into is A, not safe, and B, not sustainable, and there's nothing that you can do about it, it's a choice that you should be able to have. And anybody moralizing about that choice is deeply, misunderstanding and deeply misguided as far as I'm concerned.
Wow, Edem, there's so much in that mind of yours, and so much from your lived experience and your attention to the lived experience of others who many of us won't necessarily be thinking about, because our frame is like this whenever it needs to be, like this. So thank you for that. Is there anything in closing from you, and then I'll do the same from Kellie, is there anything you would signpost people to that they can Google, or that we can stick in the chat or in the
I definitely encourage people to look up reproductive justice. Definitely read. Lots of people have written about it, have really expanded on it. I mean, we can take reproductive justice globally, right? When we think about Trump being president and a global gag rule, and we know that because of colonialism and racism, America was sadly providing a lot of the contraceptive needs and reproductive needs, including abortions, for a lot of women in the global South. So what did that mean for their reproductive choices when that's taken away, right? That's not something we really have a conversation about. So I think, it's important for us to think that, when I think about the fact that we continue to have access issues here, whether it's in England, whether it's in Wales, whether it's in Northern Ireland, I think sometimes it really helps to put that frame globally, because then you begin to understand that it's actually part of the marginalization of women, right? Or people who will be perceived as women. So I think it's really important for people to try and find out what other experiences that are there beyond yours. I think it's important that even if you are someone off faith, to not tend to moralize people's lives. I think coming with an open mind, a broad mind, and try and understand where people are coming from. And again, I just want to say, you can check out Decolonizing Contraception's work. We really try and deal with sort of the legacy of colonialism and the medical field and how it affects Black and Brown communities. I know that might make people feel a bit uncomfortable, but if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not unlearning some of the things that you already know. So I'd say lean into the uncomfortableness, because it ultimately is trying to make us all a better person.
Thank you so much, Edem. Kellie, do you want to signpost us to anything that we can follow up if people's interest has been piqued?
Yeah, well, I prepared a wee bit of a list of books, because I know that the Corrymeela audience are really good readers. I'm not a good reader. I tend to learn things as I go along, and then somebody tells me afterwards, oh, there's a book about that. But I would say that Loretta Ross and Ricky Sollinger's book, Reproductive Justice, an Introduction, is obviously the place to start if you want to read into the reproductive justice framework. They were two of the founding mothers of the movement. I mentioned Margaret Kamatsuka's book. It's really, as I said, heavy duty theology and church history. So it's not for the faint-hearted. There is a more accessible book by Rebecca Todd Peters, who is a Christian ethicist. And she's writing very much from her lived experience as a clergy woman who has had an abortion. But from that starting point, she does a whole kind of Christian ethical discussion of the issue, and it's called Trust Women, a Progressive Christian Argument for Reproductive Justice. And I like that she particularly was into why the reproductive justice framework really spoke to her faith. And that is something I'm seeing in my analysis of lots of pro-choice faith organizations. I've just done a kind of thematic analysis for any of the academics in the room as to what are the most common themes that they raise in their discourse, in their language. And some of the themes are, conscience, choice, women as capable moral agents making decisions about their lives. But the biggest theme by a country mile is reproductive justice. The language of social justice, gender justice, racial justice is all over the pro-choice faith organizations. And by that, I mean organizations you can look up online, like the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, Faith Allowed, who offer clergy-led pregnancy counselling, Catholics for Choice. I've actually started to compile on Twitter a list of pro-choice faith voices. So if anybody wants to look on my Twitter, you can probably get access to that list. But yeah, I think as Edem said, just really push into that, read things that you would never when we read things that do make you feel uncomfortable. Can I say one last thing? I know you have to finish up soon, but this is going to weigh on me if I don't say it. Because of the nature of some of the questions, I feel, I ended up talking a little bit about the real hard cases, which we talk about a lot in the abortion discourse here. The really difficult, tragic cases of some of those fetal anomalies. I just want to reflect a wee bit on the fact that in the south of Ireland, when the repeal the 8th referendum was being discussed, the whole lead up to that, those hard cases became very central to the discussion. And I felt really strongly at the time that what was missing was just conversations about ordinary everyday abortions. I have had one of those. And so I, at the time, wrote my story down and sent it into the Irish Times. And I think the headline that they chose for it was "My abortion was ridiculously normal," or ordinary, ridiculously ordinary, or something like that. Well, I didn't use the word normal because normal doesn't exist. But, I think we have to kind of bear in mind as well that we have to go beyond the cases that pull at the heartstrings, that we can, kind of imagine must have been a really difficult, tragic situation to be in. And just remember that every woman, every person with a uterus has to have that space to be a capable moral agent in charge of their own life. And that's the bottom line for me as well. I've walked that path and I've written a bit about that online. So if you want to Google, you can look up some of the places where I've shared my story. It's always surrounded by other contextual factors. Nobody just goes, "Will I or won't I?" There's always a whole heap of stuff, and it might not be the kind of stuff that grabs headlines, but it's your life, and it's your struggle, and all the things that you have to weigh up within your own journey. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. I really thank you. Thank you to you both. You've been brilliant. We will gather up some of those things that you shared and put them in the next email out to the circulation list. It's been just such a privilege to talk to both of you. I'll talk about next week. So Rebecca Dudley and Philippa Jordan will be discussing theology and climate justice. There was an email that went out with some pre-reading. We're getting pretty hardcore at this point in Lent, everyone. So since we're not eating chocolate or crisps or all that sort of thing, it means we've got hopefully more time to pre-read. So you can check that out. We would also want to mention the fact that next week is a week whenever Europe isn't yet in daylight savings. So there's 1 fewer hour between Europe and North America. So for those of you that are joining us from over the water, you maybe pay attention to that. And remember that you can sign up for Spirituality of Conflict, which is www.spiritualityofconflict.com/sign-up. Which is a great resource offering reflections on Sunday gospel texts through the lens of conflict. And with that, we will bid you farewell. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next week. All the best, everyone.